So this one is just going to be playing by ear and getting some
Yep.
initial thoughts down with someone I obviously admire and trust on this topic. I wanted to cover a few things. But I wanted to speak to you about computational biology, what that means, and how you're working within that.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to move towards collective intelligence and see how collective intelligence is being used within the work that you're doing.
Basically, what I've been working on is around like topics in computational biology, which approaches the understanding of complex systems. And I've applied this towards developmental biology as a thing. And so developmental biology is more the study of how an organism is going to go from one cell and differentiate into a complexity of myriads of cells that make stuff like humans or insects or plants or any like multicellular organism. Also, I guess I'm more interested in trying to come up with new ways and new solutions to study that problem, right? And so I started by studying physics before I went towards biology, and then from biology I like went back towards like applied math modeling and things like this. So I sort of like zoomed through fields during my education to understand that problem and that question of developmental biology, right? To understand different problematics within it. And so what I then did from there is that I needed to learn tools, methodologies, and algorithms and models, and there's like so much knowledge already on how do you do data science, right? Like how do you study any sort of model, any sort of system that is a complex system, and how do you study it to make sense of it using physics and tools and statistics like
Right.
and algorithms, big data, all of that stuff. It is a bit more new to it on biology, right? I would say that the approach of computational biology sort of started about 20 years ago in the early 2000s. Like there was like bioinformatics a bit before that, but like conceptualizing the use of computers to study the complexity of biology is recent, all right? And so the reason it's recent is mostly just because of the availability of computers and data.
Right.
And so until the early 2000s, which didn't have the computers or the database to actually do anything about those things, right? But it was conceptualized much before Alan Turing and all of the mathematicians, right? Like in the 40s, 50s, like, they conceptualized that the complexity is you can mathematize this complexity and make problems that you can then try to study and learn from using applied math, which today means algorithms, right?
Right.
Yeah. So what I do and what I've done the last 7 years was trying to embed myself within that field, to try to first study stem cells. So I've done a lot of work on stem cells and regenerative therapy, but it was a bit too applied for my taste.
Right.
So I decided to do my PhD on more fundamental questions. And so I went to study the evolution of the reproduction strategies of insects-ish. Well, like not exactly reproduction strategies, but the way the germline is specified in insects. And so I think it sort of deserves a bit more of an explanation, because the germline is this concept in biology, which in multicellular organism, which is super interesting.
Yeah.
So when you have the evolution of multicellularity, right, you go from one bacteria or unicellular organism, and then this unicellular organism starts to become 2 cells, 3 cells, 20 cells, 100 cells aggregated together, right?
Yeah.
Then you have this problem in evolution, which is, okay, but who gets to reproduce? Who gets to pass down their genome to the next generation, right? Because now this one cell that never had this problem now finds itself in this group of cell, right?
Right.
And only some of the cells, or maybe all of the cell, will actually, like pass down their genome to the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as do sort of like an aggregate that is not differentiated and they're just sort of living collectively-ish but still retaining their individuality, it's not a problem. But when you start to have differentiation and you start to have cells that like actually start to lose capacities within their differentiation to be able to maximize the whole, the community's fitness, right?
Right.
You can think about this as human society,
Yeah.
right? Where like you can have 100 people and everybody's a hunter-gatherer, right? And then everybody does the same thing. And if you lose one or add one, it doesn't really change much in the balance of the group. But then you have societies now that start to create themselves, and then you have the person that makes the tool, and the person that hunts, and the person that gathers, and the person that cooks, right? And each of those persons don't really know how to do the rest,
Yeah.
right? The other activities, but the society as a whole becomes better because each of those persons becomes an like more expert at what they do. The fitness of the group just like increases, right? But the fitness of each individual alone decreases, right? And so for cells in an organism, it's the same concept. You have like multicellular organisms, like each cell just like loses in its capacity to survive alone, right? But they still need to reproduce. This organism still need to reproduce in some form or another. And so one of the way which has evolved, and like it's actually the main way for animals, right?
Yeah.
Is the creation of what we call the germline. And so the germline is this group of cells that very early on in development will separate from the rest. And those cells are the ones that will reproduce. They're the one which will create the sperm and the eggs, right?
Okay.
And so that capacity now to pass down the genome to the next generation is now separated. All the rest will die. Our body will die, right? Our skin, like the cells in our skin will not pass down that genome. Only our sperm and eggs will, right, pass down the genome through reproduction. And so this phenomena, right, is what we call the evolution of germline. And how to choose that group of cell, right? Because it happens early, but you still need to choose which cell will become germline and which cell will not become germline. That split, that is a phenomena that has seen many different mechanisms in evolution, right? So there's many ways different organisms will do this. And so in insects in particular, right, there is like multiple ways system to study how this phenomena evolves because we've seen many transitions, right? And so through those transitions, I basically focused most of my PhD on studying what drives those transition and what are the sort of like mechanism that made insects adopt one strategy or the other. Okay. Which mode of specification of the germline inside the embryos of insects. Okay, so that's like sort of what I studied, and how I studied it is the sort of thing which is a bit bizarre in biology, I would say, which is to like use computers and use like algorithms and new methodologies using big data, right? So in order to study this, most people before they would have taken and maybe they took a cricket, okay, and they look at the cricket and they look at the fly and they look at how does the fly and the cricket specify their germline, okay, and then they will try to come to conclusion using both of those single species from separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolution, and just come up with a conclusion with this. And a better scientist of this methodology will take 10, right? They will sample maybe 10, maybe 15, but that's like the human sort of like capacity is to do like that order of species. What I do is that I try to use things that are more holistic, right? So when I try to study this, for example, I worked on over 3,500 species at the same time, right? Because like we have computers to do this now, right? So we can create algorithms that will try to reproduce the things we would do by hand on the collective knowledge that is built by so many researchers, right? Being either the publications that have like people have done or the databases that were created also, right? So there's like many different databases of genomes and transcriptomes and like like the DNA of all of those insects, they're like sequenced now and we can access them for free and do research on them. So like that is what allows my work to exist, right? Because there is such a corpus of data, I can then go and grab from this data and try to figure out new ways to craft around that, and just craft new mechanisms of questions that will bring modern answers to those questions, right? Yeah. So that's sort of computational biology and what I've done over the last years.
So if we think about the understanding the germline, well, do we have an understanding of how insects or how the cells determine which will become the germline? Do we understand that that in at least a few species?
Well, I mean, I would say we understand it in the fly,
right?
Like fairly well ish, but like pretty well. And so in the fly, there's this thing where one end of the embryo, so the embryo of a fly looks like an oval shaped egg, and so at one end you'll have a molecule called Oscar. It's gene, which makes a protein, and that is deposited at the one end of the embryo. At the very early like within the first like dozen or so division of cells at the beginning of embryogenesis, some of those cells that are assigned that will find themselves next to this end of the embryo which has Oscar on it, well, they'll attach there and they'll just separate from the embryo, right? They'll just like detach themselves, and they'll make a small group of cells called the pole cells, right? And those cells will become the germline, right? And there's still like other mechanism of like like competition within those cells of who's going to become the germline, right? But like like random motion of cells in the first division, you'll end up at the right place at the right time, then you become germline, right? So it's like sort of like being there at the right place at the right time.
I think that's interesting. The way I understand it is that, well, the way you've described that is that there's no decision making being done by the individual cells. It's the structure, it's the framework within which they live in, within which they exist, that determines, who becomes the germline. Is it the same for? So you're about to discuss crickets. What is the difference there?
Yeah, so for crickets it's a bit different, right? So like in cricket is more, it's also the same. It's also like essentially it's the same, but that's the truth for like development in general. Being at the right place at the right time. But for crickets is like you don't have this at the beginning of embryogenesis. It happens much later, where you have already thousands and thousands of cells, and in one location you have this little tiny pocket, this little niche of something that happens where the right set of signals are sent at this location, right? And the cells that are there, right, and that are primed-ish, they will become germline. They will then transform into germline, right? But like they weren't predetermined at all, like because there's so much more mixing of cells by that stage that like what you said of like trying to remove the individuality of the self, trying to become the germline, right? Like once you remove this complete, like at that sort of stage, which is way later, you can remove that sort of ideology ish. But at the same time, I actually want to sort of say no, and you can take the complete reverse sort of like principle, which is like, okay, but how do you become the cell that is at the right space at the right time? Okay. Because then it's like, okay, but if I'm a cell and I can game this, if I can game my trajectory so that I end up in the right place, then I actually have more chances to, like transfer my genome to the next generation as a cell. In competition where like cells that have been primed to become germline in Drosophila, right? Like they will then compete with each other to actually become the one that will participate in sperm or egg formation, right?
Wow. Okay.
Because like you have like something like 200 pole cells that are created,
but
from those 200, only like 40 will actually make it at the end, right? So what happens to the 160? Who makes it in that race, right? So like this sort of thing will like still happen, and like my PhD advisor, like her whole thesis, which is like a while ago, was like actually studying this, like trying to study how do cells will just like attack, like not compete with each other. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yes and no. It's being at the right place at the right time. But if you can game it,
If you can
then
game
like,
it.
is it actually, you know, completely random? Computational biology is exactly the tool to study that, because like, I haven't done it, but like, it's something you could do. Is like, you take 1,000 Drosophila embryo and you look at the cells and how they divide in the embryo, right? And where
Right.
they end up. And then you can try to be like, okay, well, I know what a random model should give me. I know
Yeah.
what a random probability should give me, but is it what I'm actually measuring, right? Am I like, is my data contradicting the model of the null model, the random model, where
Right.
no one is gaming the system,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then you can actually look at it and you see whether or not it's the case. I don't know of any study that has done that so far, but it would be an interesting one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's interesting. So there may be some cells that are somehow gaming the system potentially.
Yes.
I'm trying to draw parallels between that and other collective intelligence systems,
Mm-hmm.
where the actual nodes are pretty dumb. Like like the nodes themselves have no broad understanding of what's happening around them, and yet they are at the right place at the right time, and they're able to do something collectively which is far beyond any individual, or even the
Mm-hmm.
sum of all the individuals could achieve.
Yeah.
How does how does
How do you mix both of them? I mean, I want to say, like, it's the same as like having different educations, right? Like,
yeah,
say you have, uh, I've had a life trajectory where I have learned biology and computer science and mathematics and things like this, right? And
yeah,
then I take someone that's done visual art, right? And then we come in the same room and we see the same conference, right?
right,
And then that conference is just going to give us very different information, just because
mm-hmm.
we have been primed in a much different
Yeah,
manner.
yeah, yeah,
I have a background, which is like my knowledge, which is different from someone else's background, right? And then ask us to work together, right? Then it's going to create more complexity, which is like really cool, because then this complexity will then be potentially bigger than the sum of both of us, right? Because we have different
yeah,
backgrounds. Like, that's like, in terms of collective intelligence and the sort of like biological analogies, like, that's how I would define it. Is that, biologically speaking, things will have a life history. That life history will prime them towards more complexity. And
right,
it is only because there is this priming and there is this differentiation within the group, within the collective, right? Like, it's still within that group. Like, and that's the important thing, is that you're different as a whole. Like, in the whole, you're different.
right,
And you're not losing the whole by becoming different. You become one part of the ensemble, but you retain that communication capacity. In biology, that's what creates complexity. I mean, not just in biology, in many, 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 many systems, that's what creates complexity, and what creates like some sort of like emergent phenomena that, like,
yeah,
we see, such as the, like, us, we're an emergent phenomena of all the cells that are inside of us, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like, our consciousness in our brain with the millions of neurons, like ants and like termites, like emergence of termites being and creating those, like, like massive structure,
yeah,
which are like insanely efficient for like making natural AC, for example. And it all comes from that. It's like, you have individuals and they're all sort of like slightly different, and they all have different life histories, but
mm-hmm.
they retain the capacity to communicate.